Happy New Beer's Eve, everybody. Okay, that was a little bit messier than anticipated. This delightful beer is called Mexicali Blues. It is brewed by the Church Brew Works in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What is New Beer's Eve, you may ask? Well, it is the celebration of the ending of Prohibition. God, I love this beer. Before we get to our travel inspiration, let's go on an interesting journey in the banning of production and sale of alcohol in the United States. New Beer's Eve is the night before the end of Prohibition, or kind of. I'll get to that in a minute. But strap in, because this is a tale for the ages. This is going to be a little bit slightly longer than my usual 3.5 minute videos, so get ready. In fact, I highly recommend grabbing one of these and settling in. Now, before I go a little bit too hard on the temperance movement, let's talk a little bit about the why Prohibition came about. And I'm going to be honest with you, I kind of understand how this all came about. See, by the 1830s, the overconsumption of alcohol was a huge problem. In fact, the average American over the age of 15 was drinking 3 times more than what they currently drink now. Alcoholism was rampant, and most of the alcoholics were men. Not only were they losing family finances on this, but, you know, sometimes booze makes people violent. In fact, it very often does. And they were taking out their violence on the women and children. Women in the 1830s had very few rights. They couldn't divorce their husbands. They didn't get that right until 1937. They couldn't vote for people who would create laws. They didn't get that until 1920. And while they had the ability to own property, they couldn't get a line of credit to either buy the property, home, or building materials without a man signing the credit papers until 1970. Ladies, take note of that. While we do give the boomers a lot of grief, if it wasn't for the female boomers, we would still be completely dependent on men for our financial needs. And they were completely dependent on them. They didn't have many choices. Now, they of course thought alcohol was the reason their lives were bad. And it was, but of course it wasn't the only reason. It was just a huge contributing factor to it. So by 1890, they got organized and started the temperance movement, and they started to make an impact. So the 18th Amendment timeline goes as such. By August 1st, 1917, the Senate passes a resolution that also presents a constitutional amendment for the banning of sales and production of alcohol in the United States. Over the course of the 17th and 18th of December of 1917, the House and Senate passed a revised resolution, and they got the required 2/3 votes to present it to the states for ratification of the Constitution. If you don't know this, 3/4 of the states have to agree for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. And at the time, there were 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska did not join the United States until 1959, so they needed 36 states out of the 48 to get the amendment passed. And they got way beyond that. Actually, 46 states passed it. The only 2 holdouts were Connecticut and Rhode Island. Cheers. Now, this process didn't happen overnight, and the 16th of January, 1919 is when the 18th Amendment was actually certified and ratified in the Constitution. Now, they still needed to create laws to enforce this amendment, so they came up with the Volstead Act. And over the course of the 28th and the 29th of October 1919, the House and Senate passed this bill. Why did it take 2 days? Because President Woodrow Wilson actually vetoed it. You know, good man, Woody. But they had enough votes in Congress to override his veto, and the Volstead Act became law. In January 17th of 1920, legal enforcement of that law began. In the very short term, right after it was passed, things did get slightly better because people didn't have access to alcohol and, you know, they were probably quite grumpy, but for the most part, you know, women's and children's lives got slightly better. But over the course Of the 13 years that Prohibition was in place, over 250,000 jobs were lost. And they weren't all just in the production and sale of beer. It included people who manufactured cans, can tops, miners. The supply chain was affected. Truck drivers lost their jobs. The entertainment venues suffered and people lost their jobs there. But that wasn't nearly as large of a problem as the problem of bootlegging was. Bootlegging was the illegal production of alcohol and gave a huge rise to organized crime. Now, after a while, the organized crime outlets, and it wasn't just the mafia, they just happened to be one of the best at it, a lot of different groups got involved. But with the rise of organized crime, they got so powerful and rich, they had the ability to pay off people like politicians, judges, and most importantly, the police. And when the law wasn't being enforced, there was a huge spike in gang violence. By the end of the 1920s, a lot of people were like, we don't think this is a good idea, and maybe it's time to reverse Prohibition. Now, unlike the 18th Amendment, the 21st Amendment kind of like zipped right along. It did not take long. And on February 20th of 1933, the Blaine Act was proposed, as well as the proposal of a new amendment. And part of the Blaine Act was allowing states to form immediate state conventions to ratify this new amendment. And all but 2 of the states voted to pass this, the holdouts, North and South Carolina. Didn't matter. They had the number they needed. And on December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was repealed. Now, interesting thing about this is that the repealing of the 18th Amendment, it was a blanket removal, but it did give the states the ability to regulate how alcohol was made and purchased, if at all, in their state. Mississippi stayed dry until 1966. In Kansas, there were no public bars until 1987. In Pennsylvania, to buy hard liquor, you have to go to a state-sponsored store. Beer and wine are more easily procured. In fact, you can buy a case of beer at a bar, which blew me away. I lived in Pennsylvania for a while, and when I found that out, I was like, what? And the state that I currently live in, Indiana, did not allow the sale of alcohol ever on Sundays until 2018. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, you've thrown out a lot of dates there, Gretchen, but nowhere in there did I hear the 6th or 7th of April. You are correct. On December the 5th, 1933, everything became official. But as soon as the Blaine Act passed, on April 7th, they allowed beer to be sold in the United States. I guess it's kind of like a peace offering. Thus, April 6th became a New Year's Eve. So if you're wondering what my travel inspiration is going to be, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, it probably should have been Pittsburgh, since I, am drinking a beer created in Pittsburgh. But I actually, when I was writing the script for this, I actually went a totally different route. See, Michigan was the first state to pass the 21st Amendment, which actually surprised me. It beat out, I assumed it was going to be Wisconsin. Michigan beat them out by 15 days. And to be completely honest, Wisconsin would have been a much easier travel inspiration because Milwaukee had so many breweries and is a huge beer town. And if you hear moaning and groaning, that's the boss, because she's up moving and she's snorkeling and snotting everywhere. But I stuck with Michigan and I decided to focus on Saugatuck. This lovely town sits on the coast of Lake Michigan, and it's basically beaches, dunes, and has a huge art scene. It is one of Fort Orr's most romantic small towns. It is one of Travel and Leisure's 10 best weekend trips from Chicago, and it is one of Condé Nast Traveler's best weekend getaways. Now, what I'm going to focus on is Mount Baldhead Park. This forested park has a steep steps up to the summit and then descends down to sandy dunes and beautiful oval beach. Not too far away is the Hotel Saugatuck for your overnight stay. So, enjoy your travel inspiration to Saugatuck, Michigan.